Careful with that cloth, Ethan murmured, his voice barely escaping into the salt-tinged air of the night. This thing has history in every grain of its wood. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, just to himself, and perhaps to the gleaming black Steinway grand piano beneath his hands, its surface shining like a mirror under the warm golden light of the old Harbor Theater. Ethan Carver, a 39-year-old janitor, single father, veteran, and an invisible figure in the world of suits and ties, crept like a shadow through the solemn stillness of the auditorium. The fundraising gala was still hours away, but the air was already alive with an invisible energy. Staff bustled about, draping white cloths over rows of wooden chairs. The soft clink of glasses echoed faintly. A group of volunteers arranged vases of hydrangeas and local wildflowers in place of expensive white orchids. A violinist rehearsed a few bars in the corner of the stage, and at the center of it all, Ethan stood, gently polishing the elegant curves of the Steinway with a worn microfiber cloth, as if touching something sacred. He paused, not because the job was done, but because he wasn't ready to leave the moment. His rough hand rested lightly on the ebony surface, his gaze drifting into the distance. Talking to the furniture again, a small voice came from behind the curtain. Ethan turned and smiled when he saw Sophie, his 8-year-old daughter, peeking out from backstage, clutching her sketchbook like a treasure. Her pale blonde hair was tied back loosely, her oversized navy hoodie hanging over faded jeans and worn sneakers. Technically, children weren't allowed to linger in the theater at this hour. But tonight, Ethan had bent the rule. Sophie had been quiet all day, and when she was that quiet, Ethan knew something was stirring inside her. He always kept an eye on her. Furniture. Ethan lifted an eyebrow, answering her with mock seriousness. No, this isn't furniture. This is a cathedral with 88 steps to heaven. He tapped the closed piano lid, referring to the 88 keys. Sophie giggled, covering her mouth, then tiptoed onto the stage and sat cross-legged on the wooden floor just outside the spotlight. She opened her sketchbook on her knees, and her pencil began to glide across the thick paper. Ethan returned to his work. One hand polished the last curve of the piano's rim. The other traced a memory. There was a time he had sat before a piano like this every day before bills. Endless overtime shifts and long nights in emergency rooms swallowed his life. Before Isabel, Sophie's mother, left this world in a hospital bed. Before grief became the constant background noise in their lives. Mr. Carver. A sharp female voice rang from the auditorium. Ethan startled and looked up. A woman in a black blazer, clutching a clipboard plastered with sticky notes, stood near the entrance. Her brows furrowed. Can you hurry that up? Ms. Hale will be here any minute, and we need everything perfect. Ethan nodded without replying. He knew his place behind the scenes, hidden and silent. He bent to gather his cleaning supplies, ready to leave the stage, when another male voice cut through the air. Deliberately loud and dripping with mockery. My God. He's stroking it like it's a long-lost lover. Ethan looked up to see a tall man descending the stairs from the small VIP balcony. Late 50s, neatly combed salt and pepper hair, polished Italian leather shoes, the kind of man who wore self-importance like expensive cologne. This was Victor Alden, music critic for the Times, a self-proclaimed connoisseur, master of detecting true talent. A few staff members nearby chuckled awkwardly. Ethan kept his head down, methodically tucking the cloth and brush into his bucket. Slower than necessary. Victor didn't stop. His voice rang with theatrical disdain. How poetic, seeing the janitor romance a piece of decor. What's next? Dropping to your knees to mop the floor in tears. This time, the laughter was louder, some unable to hold it back at the mean-spirited jab. Ethan said nothing. But Sophie had stopped drawing without him noticing. Her eyes sought her father's face. She recognized that shadow in his expression. The clenched jaw, the slight tremor in his shoulders, the quiet before a storm rising inside. Ethan took a deep breath, lifted the bucket of dirty water, and began walking toward the wings. Hold on, Victor called after him, grinning widely. Tell me, janitor. He stressed the word. Do you even know what that so-called treasure you're fawning over really is? That instrument you treat with nauseating reverence. Ethan's steps halted at the edge of the stage. Slowly, he turned to face Victor. No anger, no wounded pride, just a calm, steady gaze. "I know," he said, his deep voice clear. "It's a Steinway Model D grand piano, 9 feet long, with over 12,000 precision moving parts. Its soundboard is made from slow-grown Sitka spruce, from high mountain ranges for ideal resonance. The rim is bent from 17 layers of hard rock maple. The keys, once ivory, are now made of synthetic material. It costs more than the Mercedes you drive, and holds more stories than every review you've ever written." Silence dropped like a velvet curtain over the stage. Victor's smile vanished. He blinked rapidly, searching for a comeback. None came. The stillness lingered a beat longer before Ethan turned and walked toward the backstage area. Sophie sprang to her feet, eyes wide with a mix of awe and pride. Ethan knelt in front of her, his damp, slightly trembling hand resting on her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked gently. She nodded. Ethan exhaled, reached into his janitor's jacket pocket, and pulled out a small silver charm in the shape of a musical note. Worn with age, he placed it in her palm. "What's this, Dad?" she whispered. Ethan smiled softly, closing her fingers around it. "To remind you," he said quietly, "that music isn't always played loud. Sometimes, the quietest melodies are the most beautiful." Just then, the grand double doors at the auditorium entrance swung open. A wave of cold air and voices swept into the theater. Stage lights and chandeliers brightened. Ushers and greeters took their positions. The evening's honored guests began to arrive, from local donors and town politicians to a few high-profile supporters invited to the event. But above all, the one who drew every gaze was Marissa Hale. She entered not merely as a performer, but as someone who seemed to own the space with her confidence. Marissa wore a deep navy wool coat over an elegant matching dress, her refined features framed by an aura of precision and command. She carried the presence of someone who had conquered both the grandest stages and the most demanding boardrooms. People spoke of her as both genius and a tyrant in the same breath, for her perfectionism spared no one. She strode down the aisle between the rows of seats, her eyes scanning the stage with sharp assessment. Her gaze paused briefly on the black piano, then her brows knit slightly, sensing a residue of tension in the air, as if she had stepped in just after an incident. "Everything ready?" she asked in a low, decisive tone to her assistant. "Yes, Ms. Hale," the assistant replied. "We just finished the final polish. Everything is perfect." Marissa nodded with satisfaction. She approached the Steinway, letting her manicured hand glide lightly across the smooth wood, like greeting an old friend. In that moment, from the shadowed wings, Ethan glanced toward the stage. Unexpectedly, Marissa's eyes lifted from the piano and found his. For the briefest heartbeat, her clear gray gaze met his deep, steady brown one. She said nothing, but her look lingered half a beat longer before she turned back to her assistant. Ethan stood still, feeling his pulse skip once. Beside him, Sophie tugged at his sleeve, whispering, "Dad, who's that lady? She looks kind of scary." She had never seen anyone quite like Marissa, cold yet magnetic. Ethan's mouth twitched into a faint smile. "Marissa Hale," he murmured. The name was far from unknown to him, even in this small town, where the tide of time moved more slowly than the outside world. Stories of the gifted local girl who left to become a piano star and high-powered businesswoman were still told with pride. Marissa was the child prodigy who had returned in glory. Ethan glanced at Sophie and winked. "She's here to play for us tonight." Sophie's eyes widened. She had never heard a live concert before. Father and daughter stepped back into the shadows, leaving the stage to the honored guests now filling the hall. The fundraising gala was about to begin. The night draped a velvet curtain of darkness over the harbor town, scattering starlight that shimmered across the still surface of the bay. Inside the theater, the tall arched windows facing the harbor were covered by heavy velvet drapes, allowing in only the faint taste of salty sea breeze. The auditorium was now packed. The old wooden rows of seats had been dressed in white fabric, adorned with string lights and wildflowers, creating a look both elegant and rustic, the unique charm of this seaside town. On stage, pure crystal light spilled down onto the grand piano, casting the shadow of Marissa Hale seated at its keys. The piano began to sing, Clair de Lune by Debussy, its tenderness flowing like moonlight across the bay. Marissa poured herself into each note, her shoulders loosening with the drifting rhythm. The hall fell into a hush, many closing their eyes to savor this rare moment of music in their busy lives. Ethan stood in the shadows backstage, still in his simple janitor's uniform. Sophie sat beside him on a prop crate, her head resting lightly on her father's arm, her eyes fixed on the stage. She had never heard a piece of music so gentle. The unfinished lines in her sketchbook were momentarily forgotten. For Ethan, it had been far too long since he had heard a complete classical piano performance. His mind vibrated like a resonating string memories. Grief and a love for music, long dormant, stirred with each note. His eyes glistened faintly in the dim light, but he smiled when he saw Sophie entranced by the melody. He slipped a strong arm gently around her shoulders, giving a light squeeze as if to say, "Beautiful, isn't it?" Sophie tilted her head up, her mouth forming a small oido, and nodded softly. The piece ended with bright, lingering chords, ringing out before fading like moonlight slipping into clouds. A breath of silence, then the hall erupted in applause. Marissa rose from the piano bench, bowing with graceful elegance to the ovation. The stage lights followed her as she stepped to the microphone at center stage, with a smile both thin and sincere. Marissa thanked everyone for coming tonight to support the town's arts fund. She spoke briefly about the meaning of this small theater, once a warehouse by the docks, now transformed into a shared space for art, and the importance of preserving it. Applause swelled again, though she didn't say it outright. Everyone understood her reference to rumors that an outside real estate corporation was aiming to buy up the harbor area, including the theater, to build a luxury resort. Marissa's smile dimmed for a moment when she mentioned the challenges ahead, but she quickly straightened and declared firmly that, with the strength of this close-knit community, art and heritage would not be erased so easily. Hearing this, Ethan's hand clenched unconsciously. He knew exactly what Marissa meant. All week, the town had been buzzing with talk of East Shore Development's interest in building a resort here. At first, some had been excited by the promise of jobs and tourism, but when they learned the project required clearing most of the old harbor, including the theater and the small square next to the Lantern Cafe, many longtime residents were furious. The town council was under intense pressure from both sides. Tonight's fundraising gala was one effort to prove to the council that the community could sustain itself without selling out to outside capital. Marissa Hale, the town's most successful daughter, had returned for that very reason. As the applause faded, the program continued with a quieter mood. Everyone carried their own worries about the uncertain future of the harbor. The host stepped out to announce a short intermission before the fundraising auction and the evening's closing performance. The audience rose from their seats, some heading to the side lobby for wine and pastries. On stage, the velvet curtain closed while crew members prepared props for the next act. Backstage, Ethan exhaled a long breath, as though releasing some of the emotions building inside. He turned to Sophie. "Did you like it?" She nodded eagerly. "I've never heard anyone play like her. Miss Hale plays the piano, and I swear it sounds like the ocean waves singing." "Dad." Ethan ruffled her hair, smiling. "Yes, she's very talented." In his eyes, there was a glint of genuine admiration. He had vaguely heard of Marissa the piano prodigy from years past, but he hadn't expected she would also be the one to stand up for the theater. Perhaps it was because this place had once been the cradle of her own music. With the audience temporarily away from their seats, the hall felt far more open. Taking advantage of the moment, Ethan quietly guided Sophie through the wings, slipping out of the stuffy backstage area. He walked down a narrow staff corridor behind the stage, a passage leading to a small door that opened onto the harbor behind the theater. The briny scent of the sea drifted in through the crack, more soothing than the air-conditioned chill inside. Ethan pressed one hand against the cold brick wall, closing his eyes to steady himself. Marissa's performance had stirred too many currents within him. Memories of music, the ache of losing his wife, the fear of losing what little remained here. All of it swirled together, leaving him unsteady. Outside, the murmur of voices and the faint clinking of glasses drifted in from the reception area, like sounds from another world. Inside him, There was only silence, a silence that pressed against his chest and whispered, "You don't belong here." It was a feeling he knew well. He should simply finish his work, take Sophie's hand, and vanish into the night the way invisible shadows always did. He had left rooms like this, lives like this, hundreds of times before. Disappearing had become a survival skill, perhaps the only talent he had left. "Dad!" Sophie's small voice floated from the far end of the corridor, yet it echoed as if calling him from deep inside. Ethan's eyes snapped open, and he turned. She stood there, small under the dim golden light, holding something in her arms. It was a worn, leather-bound notebook he recognized instantly, his music theory notebook. His chest tightened. He had kept it tucked deep in his personal locker at home, untouched for years. Somehow, Sophie was holding it now. I found this in your drawer," she mumbled, as if afraid he might scold her for rummaging through his things. "I thought maybe you'd forgotten what was inside." Ethan drew in a slow breath and stepped toward her. Gently, he took the notebook from her hands. The leather cover was cracked, its edges curled and stained with time. He opened to a few pages. The familiar staff lines greeted him, marked with notes he had once written long ago, silent now, still and waiting. Fragments of unfinished melodies, scribbled notations from a younger, hungrier self. His heart ached. Near the back, he came to a page with a title written in capital letters, "Theme for Sophie," the faded ink revealing a piece he had never completed. He blinked hard, fighting the surge of emotion. Where did you learn to be this bold?" he asked, his voice catching. "From you," Sophie said with a tiny shrug. "Except for the times you forget you're brave." Ethan knelt, resting both hands on her small shoulders. "I don't want you to remember tonight, because you saw them mocking me," he said, his voice rough. "I don't want this night burned into your memory for the wrong reasons." Sophie tilted her head, studying him. Her wide brown eyes held a seriousness far beyond her years. "I won't remember what they said about you," she replied slowly. "I'll remember that you stood there, on that stage, like you knew something they didn't." Her innocent yet piercing words hit Ethan harder than any of Victor's earlier barbs. He stared at her, momentarily speechless. Sophie lowered her gaze, gathering her courage to continue, almost whispering, "You still love the piano, don't you?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked down at the music notebook in his hands, then back at her expectant face. She was waiting, her eyes bright with hope. At last, he nodded, admitting in a deep, quiet voice he hadn't used for truth in a long time, "I love it. The way some people love someone they've lost silently." From across the street, never daring to get too close, his voice trembled at the end. Sophie thought about his words, her young mind trying to grasp the depth of an adult's sorrow. Then, with the fearless innocence of an 8-year-old, she reached out her small hand and took his. "Maybe it's time you crossed the street." Ethan stilled. He felt as though a door had just opened inside him, a door leading to the very path he had feared and avoided for so long. Out in the theater, the host was already announcing the end of intermission. Soft background music began to play. Ethan gave her hand a gentle squeeze, as if drawing strength from it. He stood, inhaled deeply, and bent to kiss the top of her soft hair. "Stay right here," he murmured. Sophie nodded, tucking herself into the corner of the hallway. Ethan placed the notebook in her hands. "Keep it for me," he said with a small smile. In his eyes, for the first time in years, a fierce resolve burned. On stage, the next part of the program began with a Mozart duet sung by 2 local opera singers. Amber-hued stage lights bathed the scene in warmth, while the decorative chandeliers high above scattered glints of light across the wooden ceiling like constellations. Ethan slipped quietly back to the wings, arms folded, working to keep his expression calm. He was still in his gray maintenance clothes, blending into the darkness behind the curtain. Sophie crouched nearby, holding her breath as she watched him. The 2 singers finished their song to polite applause. The host returned, his professional smile beaming. "And now," he announced brightly, "before we close tonight's program with our final performance, we have a little surprise." Ethan felt his shoulders tense. Something was coming, something unscripted. The host's grin widened. "Sometimes The most wonderful music isn't on the program. Sometimes, it's right here in the room. A ripple of whispers stirred through the audience like wind in the trees. And then came the smirk Ethan had already predicted. Like a forecast of bad weather, Victor Alden rose from his seat near the edge of the stage, eyes glinting with mischief. "I have a small suggestion," he said loudly, raising his wine glass like a toast. "Our new friend from earlier, the janitor, seems to have quite the poetic soul, perhaps even a musical one." Laughter scattered through the crowd, some joining in, some exclaiming in surprise. Ethan's heart thudded. Victor glanced around, then aimed his gaze directly at the wings where Ethan stood in shadow. "What if, tonight, he gave us a little surprise of his own? I'd like to suggest he gift us a few notes. I mean, clearly he knows how to treat a Steinway like a true expert." Polite chuckles rippled. In the front row, Marissa turned sharply, her brows knitting in disapproval. "Mr. Alden," she said, her voice low but edged with warning, "I'm afraid your suggestion—" But Victor lifted a hand, as if asking her indulgence, and went on in a sugar-sweet tone disguised as generosity. "Come now, let's give our janitor the chance to show us his hidden talent. You spoke so eloquently earlier about this piano, why not let your hands speak now? Let us hear a bit of janitorial genius. Who knows, he might even surprise us." This time, the laughter grew louder, some amused, some awkward, most unsure how to react. Clearly, more than a few guests found the situation an entertaining diversion. Overhead, a spotlight swept toward stage, right the very place where Ethan stood. Even without its direct beam, he could feel hundreds of eyes turning toward him. Sophie stiffened beside him, her eyes wide with alarm. She gripped the hem of his shirt, whispering shakily, "Dad, don't go if you don't want to." The moment stretched, time slowing until every sound seemed distant. Ethan looked down at her anxious face. In his past life, he might have politely declined the cruel invitation, let the wave of mockery pass, and gone on with his fragile dignity intact. But this time, something burned in his chest. Sophie's words echoed in his mind. "You stood there, like you knew something they didn't." He did know something, something Victor could never understand. The true meaning of music, of passion, of the pain that fuels it. He no longer felt shame or fear, only the pull of a chance. A chance to step across the invisible line he had drawn for himself all these years. Ethan straightened and stepped out of the shadows. Sophie's hand slipped from his shirt as she held her breath. The hall fell utterly silent. In the taut stillness, Ethan Carver walked slowly onto the stage. Each footstep on the wooden floor landed with deliberate weight, louder than any applause. He approached the Steinway, warm under the lights, but did not sit down immediately. Instead, he faced the audience, his head high, his features sharp under the glow. His voice was not loud, but it carried clearly to the overhead microphones. "I didn't come here tonight to perform," he said. A faint murmur stirred in the crowd, then hushed. "I came here to mop floors, take out the trash, and make sure no one trips over a broken chair. That's the job I'm paid to do." A few in the audience pressed their lips in faint, uncomfortable smiles. Ethan paused, his eyes sweeping toward Victor Alden, who sat with arms crossed, frowning. Then Ethan went on, his deep, rough tone slicing through the quiet. "But sometimes life doesn't care what you're paid to do. Sometimes it dares you to remember who you used to be." For a heartbeat, the silence was so pure, you could almost hear the ocean's waves tapping against the harbor walls outside. In the front row, Marissa leaned forward slightly, her lips parting as if to speak, but she said nothing. Her gaze locked on the man standing at center stage. Ethan looked down at the piano before him. The keys gleamed like the familiar smile of an old friend. The Steinway waited patiently, as though unsure how to start the conversation. He drew in a deep breath and sat. Not like a performer taking his place, but like a man returning home after a long journey. His back was straight, yet relaxed, his shoulders loose. His calloused hands hovered over the keys, fingers heavy with memory. He didn't play at once, just touched lightly, feeling the weight he knew so well. Then he glanced at Victor, frozen in his seat, and allowed a faint, sardonic smile. "You suggested Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star earlier, didn't you?" His voice was warm but edged with steel. "I'm afraid I'm about to disappoint you." The first note, low G, rang out, not timid but clear, like a whisper against the ear. Then, suddenly, a cascade, his fingers sweeping into the opening of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The melody rose from the piano like smoke from a snuffed candle, delicate, curling, then catching a gust, swelling into waves of sound. Ethan's hands didn't move with speed for show, but with unshakable certainty, the certainty born from sleepless nights, from lost love, from clinging to the one thing that had never betrayed him, music. At first, a few chuckled, expecting a playful tune, but soon they fell still. There was no joke here, only music. Music raw, alive, bearing the soul's fragility. Ferocious arpeggios like storms gave way to sudden pianissimo, tender as a lullaby, soothing a sob. Strength followed surrender. Surrender followed strength. He played like someone who had lived inside every note before letting his hands touch the keys, as if each chord had flowed in his blood for years. Now finally given voice, the hall held its breath. No one saw a janitor now. They saw a man, a solitary father, a soldier who had survived fire, a forgotten artist. They began to realize they were witnessing a soul speak aloud. Marissa Hale, in the front row, had a hand over her chest without realizing it, as though to steady her racing heart. Her eyes shone, never leaving the man at the piano. Victor Alden sat frozen, wine glass suspended midair, forgotten. From the wings, Sophie peeked out, her sketchbook slipping to the floor unnoticed, pages fluttering in the sea breeze drifting through the hall. The ballad climbed to its peak, then sank into warmth, like a storm giving way to sunlight. Ethan struck the final chords, brilliant harmonies reverberating through the hall. The last note shimmered in the air, suspended, then faded into a sacred silence. One clap broke it, Marissa, rising to her feet. She applauded slowly at first, then with gathering force, her eyes fixed on him. The rest of the hall seemed to wake from a dream. They began to stand one by one. Then all at once, thunderous applause filled the wooden theater, not out of politeness but from awe and gratitude. Ethan sat motionless for a moment, as if returning from another world. Slowly, he stood, facing those who had mocked him only moments ago, and now clapped until their hands were red. He did not bow, he only dipped his head slightly. A quiet thank you, his gaze passing over the faces of those who had misjudged him. Turning, he stepped toward the wings. On the way, he bent to pick up the familiar cleaning cloth lying at the piano's base, as if retrieving his coat before leaving a party. He walked off stage, head high. The applause still roared behind him, but Ethan didn't need it. He had something far more important waiting. At the edge of the wings, Sophie stood with tear-bright eyes, glowing with pride. The moment she saw him, she ran into his arms. "Dad," was all she managed before her voice broke. Ethan set the cloth down on a chair and knelt to hold her tightly. She buried her face in his shoulder, dampening his shirt with tears. His own eyes stung. He rubbed her trembling back, murmuring, "It's okay, sweetheart, it's okay." But inside him, a flood surged relief, joy, pride, and above all, love for the daughter who had believed in him. Amid the thunder of applause outside, it was just the two of them, in the backstage shadows, holding each other close, quietly crying and quietly smiling. The final note of the piece seemed to linger somewhere among the wooden beams above, mingling with the applause that shook the air in the hall. Ethan released Sophie, brushing away a stray tear on her cheek with his thumb. She smiled through the shimmer of tears, and to Ethan, it felt as if the whole world had brightened around him. He had done it. He had crossed the road of his own fear. Leaning back against the backstage wall, Ethan closed his eyes for a few seconds to steady his breath. His chest rose and fell in long, deliberate breaths. His hands still trembled, not from nerves or fear, but from release. That performance had been a letting go, a confrontation with all the versions of himself he had buried for survival. The hurried sound of footsteps echoed on the wooden floor backstage. Ethan opened his eyes. Marissa Hale was walking toward him. She stopped a short distance away, her clear gaze fixed on him. as though she was still trying to reconcile what she had just witnessed on stage with the simple man standing before her. They regarded each other in wordless stillness. Marissa spoke first, her voice low and soft, so unlike the sharp edge she'd carried earlier on stage. "Where have you been hiding all this time?" Ethan blinked, then gave a faint smile. He shrugged lightly, answering with dry humor. "Under a few tool cabinets, behind broken vending machines, between overdue rent notices." Marissa gave a brief laugh, the first genuine one he'd seen from her all evening. She shook her head at his dry remark, her gaze softening. "What you gave out there, it wasn't just music." She searched for the word. It was pain and hope woven into the same melody. Ethan finished for her, his eyes drifting to some vague point in the air, as though he had only just realized it himself. Marissa exhaled, nodding. "Exactly." They stood again in silence. It was no longer the awkward quiet of strangers, but the silence when two souls have just touched, needing no words to understand. Marissa folded her arms, as if bracing against her own emotion. "When you played, I didn't see a janitor anymore," she said, her gray-blue eyes steady on his. "I didn't even just see a musician. I saw a man who had walked through fire and come out carrying a melody still whole." Ethan glanced down at his hands, the fingers still holding the memory of the music that had poured through them. "Funny thing," he said quietly. "That piece used to terrify me. I thought it was too exposed, too vulnerable. But now, playing it, it felt like coming home." He looked up, meeting her gaze with steady eyes. "I just had to lose everything else for those notes to ring true." Marissa didn't reply, but her lashes trembled. The stage lights, dim as they were now, still caught the sheen of moisture in her eyes. Beyond the velvet curtain, the audience began to disperse after the closing thanks, though in one corner, a few small groups still sat as if reluctant to leave. Lexington Hall. No, this was the theater of a small town, but for the first time in its short history, it didn't know what to do with the air it now held. The guests in velvet gowns and tailored suits, the ones fluent in social smiles and polished small talk, now sat quietly in clusters like survivors of something sacred. Conversations dropped to hushed murmurs, careful and reverent. Laughter, if it came at all, carried a softer, more respectful tone. Ethan Carver, the invisible janitor, had stepped off the stage minutes ago, but his music had not left. It still lived in the exposed beams above, in the worn wooden floorboards, in the stunned hush after the final chord. Mrs. Evelyn Ashcroft, a widowed patron of the arts for decades, sat in the second row, dabbing at the corner of her eyes with a silk handkerchief. "I haven't cried at a concert since my husband passed," she whispered to the person beside her, her voice trembling. "But that man, he played like he was holding someone's memory in every note." Elsewhere, a young violinist from the local orchestra stood with his case in hand, his gaze distant. "All this time I've only played with technique," he murmured, "that just now, that was music from the soul." Near the aisle, Victor Alden sat rigid, staring at the untouched wine in his hand. The man who had built his career on dissecting music with cold precision now couldn't find a coherent critique. His face carried a flicker of confusion, mixed with something like resentment. "He's not formally trained. Played too rough, too emotional," Victor muttered, as if to shield himself. But the words rang hollow. Even to him, the truth was, Victor had been moved, deeply wounded, even not by technical flaws, which perhaps no one had noticed, but by something too honest to dismiss. An unknown janitor had just made the finest performances Victor had heard in 20 years feel small by comparison. His lips pressed into a thin line. Setting down his wine, he rose and left without a word to anyone. After the farewells to guests, the theater lights dimmed, leaving only a few warm bulbs hanging like remnants of a party just ended. Volunteers began to clear the space on the now empty stage. The Steinway rested quietly after its night of glory, its lid closed. After leaving Sophie in the care of stage manager Mindy backstage, Ethan returned alone to the dim stage, feeling the sacred stillness. He laid a hand on the piano's side, stroking it once in a silent thank you. "I never thought I'd see you at the keys again." A low male voice broke the quiet. Marissa looked up from the piano, where she sat with the lid open. her fingers just having released a low A minor chord, rich as a secret kept for years. She turned toward the right wing. Ethan stood there, arms folded, a faint smile on his face. Feels just right. Like putting on an old coat. Doesn't it? She asked. Ethan stepped closer. The funny thing about old coats, he said, is you forget how warm they are until someone hands them back to you. Marissa laughed softly, the sound hanging in the air like a small wind chime. They stood by the piano, facing each other. The moment balanced between polite conversation and something deeper. I should thank you, she said, for taking that challenge earlier. Ethan shook his head. You don't need to thank me. I should apologize for surprising you and everyone that way. She waved a hand lightly. I only regret letting Alden go too far. She glanced toward the wings where Sophie waited, then back at him. There was a moment when I saw her standing there, and I was looking too. I knew if I didn't speak, no one else would for the two of you. Ethan nodded. Still, thank you. But let me ask you something. She tilted her head for him to continue. Why would someone like you? He gestured toward the doors where the last guests had left. With all the praise and prestige, still be sitting here alone at the piano at the end of the night. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes dimmed with a flicker of sadness. Because no matter how loud the applause is, she said slowly, it never drowns out the regrets. A lump rose in Ethan's throat. He knew exactly what she meant. I thought music was something I'd left behind, he said quietly. Turns out it was only waiting in silence inside me. Marissa nodded. She looked at him for a long moment. In the fading light, they stood in stillness, the piano between them like a mute witness to a connection forming. Then Sophie came running onto the stage, clutching his old music notebook. Dad, she called, eyes alight. Can you play me the song you used to play for Mom? The one you said was too sad to play anymore. Ethan froze for a moment, glancing from his daughter to Marissa with slight awkwardness. But Marissa didn't smile. Her gaze was warm, patient. Ethan swallowed. Maybe. It's sad because I never finished it, he murmured. Marissa stepped away from the bench, smiling in encouragement. She rested her hand lightly on the piano's edge, tilting her head. Then finish it, she said. Her voice was soft, yet certain, as if it were the only right thing to do. You don't owe anyone a performance. Just play it through for her, for you, and maybe for the one who couldn't hear it to the end. She nodded toward Sophie. Ethan looked at her, then at his daughter. Sophie stood waiting, the small musical note charm he'd given her earlier, now hanging from a chain around her neck, glinting faintly as if cheering him on. Ethan drew a deep breath. Finally, he moved to the bench. The motions came as naturally as breathing, adjusting the seat, stretching his fingers, sitting straight but relaxed. The room fell silent. Even the last volunteers in the distance paused to watch. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, then placed his hands on the keys and began to play. No sheet music before him, no audience except Sophie and Marissa, and a few curious eyes peeking from the wings. The opening notes were hesitant, imperfect, but sincere. It was the lullaby he had written for Isabel after Sophie was born, a lullaby he had never played to its end. The melody was gentle as a mother's whisper at a crib, sorrowful yet tender. In it was the ache of loss, but also a fragile thread of hope woven through every pause. He played with all the love and longing he carried. Midway, a soft, recurring phrase pulsed like a heartbeat, steady, a brave. Marissa stood still, feeling something old and aching opening in her chest. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, clutching her sketchbook, eyes wide and glassy, as if afraid to miss a single note. When Ethan lifted his hands from the final chord, the note faded into the quiet, then vanished into the night. There was no applause, only silence full, meaningful. Sophie wiped her eyes, rose, and wrapped her arms tightly around him from behind. Marissa bit her lip, her lashes damp, one hand pressed to her chest, as if holding her heart together. Ethan bent his head to rest his cheek against his daughter's hair, his shoulders trembling. That night, as the last lights went dark, the three of them, a father with a heart scarred by loss, an artist hiding behind lonely triumphs, and a little girl who believed in miracles found each other in the gentle darkness of music. That very night, the story of the janitor who played piano began to spread. In the age of social media, a few short videos of Ethan playing and leaving the stage, paired with heartfelt captions, were shared widely. By the next morning, a grainy clip with clear audio on the town's Facebook page had thousands of views. Elderly women watched on iPads, old fishermen on worn phones, all nodding. The small town buzzed like a hive. Everyone spoke of the janitor who turned out to be a hidden artist. A regional newspaper even sent a reporter for an interview. In one night, Ethan Carver had gone from unknown to a source of both pride and curiosity. But alongside the pride, another tide was rising. East Shore Development, perhaps sensing the community spirit surging, accelerated its plans. Just 2 days after the concert, an official proposal arrived at the town hall to buy the entire harbor district, including the theater, the small square, the old warehouse, and the docks at a sky-high price. They promised to turn the area into a luxury resort with a private marina. In return, the town would receive development funds and jobs. The council scheduled a vote in 1 week, a ticking clock hanging over the heads of those who loved the place. Marissa Hale called Ethan as soon as she heard. That evening, at the Lantern Cafe overlooking the harbor, they sat across from each other at a pine table, a small oil lantern flickering between them. The lantern had been in Marissa's family since her grandfather's time, now a favorite meeting spot for locals. Its walls were lined with antique glass lanterns and black and white photos of the town's past. Marissa stirred her chamomile tea, her gaze far beyond the window, where the harbor swallowed one boat after another into the night. "If that proposal passes, they'll tear down the theater," she said, her voice heavy. Not just the theater, they could take the square, the art warehouse, even the wooden pier for a private marina. Ethan stared into the steam rising from his black coffee, his chest tightening at the thought of losing the beloved theater and the old dock Sophie loved to watch waves from. "What can we do?" he asked quietly. Marissa looked up, her eyes lit with determination. "We fight. I don't believe people here will sit by and let someone steal the town's soul." She leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. "I've thought about it. The community spirit is sky high after the concert. People are talking about you everywhere, your story, your talent. If we can harness that." Ethan flushed, uneasy. "My story isn't." "It is," Marissa cut in firmly. "You are living proof that the value of art is right here in our own community. People can argue an old theater brings no profit, but tell me, has any resort ever made an entire town cry from sheer emotion the way they did that night?" She paused, her voice thick with feeling. "Ethan, your music touched people's hearts. It reminded them, we have values that can't be measured in money." Ethan stayed silent, unused to such praise. He turned to the window. The harbor lay in darkness, lit only by the faint gold glow of a few small fishing boats. Memories came in a rush, arriving here after Isabel's death, sitting for hours with Sophie by the dock, listening to the waves. Summer evenings with ice cream on the lantern steps, watching the sun sink into the sea. Sophie laughing and running across the outdoor stage at the summer festival. Would any of that survive if this place were leveled for glass towers and luxury yachts? Marissa's hand touched his, pulling him back. "We have 1 week," she said. "I've reached out to some media friends. They'll help spread the town's story if we give them something big. And I think we should hold a community concert right on the docks. A concert for the harbor. On the docks." Ethan frowned. "Yes, on the outdoor stage at the pier, where we hold the end of summer festival. We'll make it a special music event, a rallying call to protect the theater and harbor. Everyone invited, free admission." Marissa's energy grew. "I'll perform, and if you agree, so will you. We can bring in local groups, the high school choir, the town's country band, the vintage music club. Make it our own festival." Ethan hesitated. The idea was huge. How could he? He had only just dared to play again after so many years now, to perform before the whole town. His gut churned with half fear, half excitement. I'm not sure," he stammered. "You mean in front of hundreds of people, Marissa's smile was gentle. You've already done it. That night in the theater, you played for hundreds, and you shone. Ethan, but that was unexpected. He protested weakly. I didn't have time to think. Now, if I plan it, I'm afraid. Afraid you'll run again? Marissa asked plainly. Afraid you'll disappear, because you think you're not important enough. Ethan bit his lip. She'd struck the truth. Marissa squeezed his hand, her eyes holding his. Don't forget. They clapped not just for your talent, but because your story touched them. A man who's endured loss yet stood tall. They saw themselves in you, Ethan. Now they need you to stand for them. He drew in a deep breath, his mind spinning. He thought of Sophie, of her future here. Would she grow up in a peaceful town or a crowded tourist hub? He remembered her face beaming when he played. She had said, I'll just remember you stood there proud. Ethan nodded, slow but sure. All right, I'll do it. For them, for Sophie, and for me too. And in saying it, he realized yes, for himself too. He didn't want to hide anymore. Marissa's smile lit up. Perfect. Then we start now. This Saturday. I'll handle the permits for public space. Do you know anyone at Town Hall? I know Luis in logistics, I'll ask him. Good. I'll use my own connections with the mayor. She used to be my mother's piano student. And I'll write a press release for the regional media. We need to make noise so the council feels the pressure. Ethan watched her orchestrate the plan with admiration. He understood now how she had succeeded beyond this town. What about me? What should I do? Marissa's eyes sparkled. You should compose something of your own. Compose, he echoed. Yes, a new piece, or finish an old one. Something truly special to play at the end of the concert. A musical message for the town's future. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. A new piece for what comes next. He thought of Isabel's lullaby. Maybe he could finish it, turning it from sorrow into hope. He nodded, more certain this time. I'll try. I think I have some ideas. Trust me, you can, Marissa said, smiling with conviction. She extended her hand across the table. Ethan took it. Her slender fingers still faintly ink-stained from signing papers earlier. They shook hands like comrades sealing a pact. But the handshake lingered a beat longer. His hand warm around hers. They let go, slightly embarrassed, but both smiling. At that moment, the cafe owner, a kindly older woman, brought over 2 mugs of hot cocoa, a gift for the town's 2 artists. Marissa chuckled, and Ethan only rubbed the back of his neck, murmuring thanks. News traveled fast here. The days that followed swept through the small town like a whirlwind. Yet it was a warm whirlwind of unity and shared purpose. Marissa and Ethan, along with a team of volunteers, threw themselves into preparations for the Music by the Harbor concert. Simple posters were printed cream background, black serif letters, with a small piano icon in the corner. The bold headline read, Concert for the Harbor, Real Music, Real Stories, Real People. The list of performers included Marissa Hale, Ethan Carver, the high school choir, the Seafarers Folk Band, and more. The posters and flyers were pinned to the notice board at the Lantern Cafe, taped to the library windows, hung on the church gate, and even sent out in the school parent newsletters. They quickly drew attention. People passed them from hand to hand at the market, in the post office, everywhere. People were talking about the upcoming concert. Ethan was as busy as anyone. By day, he still worked his regular janitorial shifts, sweeping leaves along the pier, tightening loose boards on the dock, helping the crew carry a few backdrops out to the outdoor stage. At night, after feeding Sophie dinner and tucking her into bed, he would sit at his desk, open his old music notebook under the warm glow of a lamp, and jot down notes for a new piece. He had decided to call it Second Chapter. It would be a piece for tomorrow, for hope. Each night, the melody grew a little longer. Sometimes, Ethan would pause, gazing out the window at the star-strewn sky, and imagine Isabel smiling in quiet approval at every note he wrote. Every morning, Sophie would wake to find her father slumped over the desk, his head resting on a page filled with dense lines of music. A small note beside it reading, "Have breakfast. I'll be right out." She knew he was working hard for everyone, so she got herself ready for school without disturbing him. Marissa moved through the town like a gust of wind that pulled everyone into the cause. She met with the town council, persuading members to postpone the resort project vote until after the concert, to listen to the will of the people. She gave back-to-back phone interviews to local newspapers, never failing to tell the inspiring story of a single father who found his voice again through music and the threat facing the town's historic theater. By Thursday evening, the regional TV station aired a short interview clip. Marissa Hale, professional yet sincere, looked straight into the camera and urged, "Let music decide the future of our harbor, not money." The segment ended with a shot of her standing beside Ethan Carver. He waved awkwardly at the TV audience and the anchor's voiceover. "Join us at Southport Pier this Saturday evening to enjoy music and help protect our beloved heritage." Friday noon, after the last school bell rang, Sophie ran straight to the office to wait for her father. That day, Ethan had arranged to pick her up early so they could go somewhere with Marissa. When his old pickup truck pulled up, Sophie was already standing with Marissa by the school gate. Marissa leaned casually against her own car, wearing comfortable flats and jeans that made her look much younger than the poised businesswoman from the other night. Spotting Ethan, she raised 2 iced coffees with a smile. "A little bribe. I need your help with something else." Ethan opened the truck door for Sophie to hop in, then walked over with a curious smile. "What is it this time?" He took the iced coffee. She handed him his favorite kind, which she clearly remembered. Marissa winked. "I do my research." They decided to take just one vehicle, leaving Marissa's car parked at the school. Sophie sat in the back seat of her dad's truck, grinning the whole way as Marissa told stories about skipping math class to practice piano when she was younger. The ocean breeze drifted in through the open windows, carrying the scent of salt and the cries of seagulls. Marissa directed Ethan to turn onto a small slope leading up to the southern hill of town, at the end of a gravel path. They arrived at a small gray stone building nestled under the shade of ancient oaks, an abandoned chapel that few people visited anymore. All 3 stepped out of the truck. The air up here was fresh and startlingly still. From this height, the entire blue expanse of the bay spread out before them, dotted with distant white sails. "This is where I had my kindergarten graduation," Sophie exclaimed. Recognizing it, it was true the old chapel had occasionally been borrowed for small events, before it fell into disuse and was locked up. Marissa pulled a heavy iron key from her pocket and unlocked the solid teak door. A musty smell and a swirl of dust spilled into the strip of golden afternoon light. "Watch your step," she said as she entered first. Inside, the chapel was cool and dim. Colored light spilled through stained glass windows in scattered patterns across the stone floor. Dust coated the long wooden pews, and cobwebs draped the corners of the vaulted ceiling. The place had clearly been forgotten for years. But in the very center of the main hall, beneath a veiled angel statue, stood a dark mahogany baby grand piano. Its lid was closed, like a small coffin in deep sleep, waiting to be awakened. Ethan froze. "This piano," he murmured, stepping toward it slowly, dust motes stirring under his feet. Marissa stood aside, her eyes lit with quiet nostalgia. "This is where I performed my first solo," she said, her voice echoing gently in the still air. "I was 10 years old. I was terrified, but I still remember that when the first note rang out, the world stopped judging." She brushed her hand lightly over the dusty surface. "Back then, the piano was brand new. My parents and teacher raised funds for months to gift it to the chapel. Then budgets were cut. The community music center was dissolved, and everything here was locked away. The piano's been silent ever since." Ethan placed his hand on the piano's side. A fine layer of dust clung to his fingers, but the wood felt sturdy. "You want me to check it over, see if I can fix it?" Marissa shook her head, stepping to the other side so they faced each other across the piano. "I want this place to be yours. Yours and Sophie's," she said earnestly. "A music room for you to practice, compose, even teach if you want. I've convinced the Arts Fund and the church to let us use it. If the concert goes well, they've promised to fund the restoration." Ethan was caught off guard. He looked at Marissa, then around the dusty but promising room. I don't know what to say. This is Unbelievably generous. Marissa smiled, shaking her head. You don't owe me anything. This isn't just generosity. It's a second chance for this place. For this piano. And for you. Ethan drew in a deep breath, his chest swelling with emotions he couldn't quite name. Walking around to the other side of the piano, he slowly lowered himself onto the worn wooden bench. Marissa gently lifted the lid for him. Inside, the strings were slack, and the hammers hadn't struck in years. Yet everything remained intact. He placed his fingers on the dust-coated keys and pressed one. The sound rang out, deep and resonant, filling the empty space and lingering in the air like a prayer in a forgotten sanctuary. Ethan looked up at Marissa, his eyes shimmering with an unspoken feeling. You're sure the ghosts here are friendly? He asked softly, half joking, his voice roughened. Marissa smiled, her gaze warm. I've brought one of them with me. I think the others will be fine. She glanced toward Sophie, who was skipping around the room, breathing in the air, twisting the hem of her school dress, humming some little tune. The sunset filtering through the stained glass set her hair aglow in shades of red and gold, like a playful halo dancing around her. Marissa and Ethan both paused to take in the sight. Their eyes met, and for a quiet moment, they shared the same warmth. They turned their gaze back to Sophie, as if she herself was the living proof of what they were fighting for the future. That afternoon, they stayed at the chapel for hours. Marissa and Sophie swept away cobwebs and flung open the windows to let fresh air in. Ethan took the chance to examine the piano. Yes, it would need its strings tuned and the hammers cleaned, but it could still play simple pieces. When Sophie kept sneaking glances at it, her eyes wide with curiosity, Ethan lifted her onto his lap in front of the keys. Marissa came over and sat beside them on the long bench. Do you want to learn to play? Marissa asked softly. Sophie nodded eagerly. Yes, please. Then she tilted her head and added, but I want to learn a sad song. The kind that somehow makes you feel happier at the end. Ethan and Marissa exchanged a look of surprise at such a whimsical, yet deeply thoughtful request. Ethan put an arm around her. Why a sad song that's happy at the end? Sophie rested her chin on her hand, thinking, because I miss Mom, and that makes me sad. But if I stay sad all the time, Mama Isabel would worry. So I want music that lets me feel sad for a little bit, just enough to make my heart lighter, and then feel okay at the end. Marissa couldn't help it. She wrapped her arms around them both, her voice thick. I understand. Then let's make that song together. As the evening deepened, in the old chapel filled with golden light, the three of them sat close on the piano bench, creating a simple piece based on Sophie's idea. Ethan played slow, steady chords with his left hand. Marissa added bright, delicate notes with her right. Sophie tapped out a few playful single notes with one finger. The music was unpolished, hesitant but warm. It was a humble duet-turned-trio, a lullaby of rebirth. In that quiet room, bathed in the last rays of sunset, three lives blended into a single melody. In the days that followed, the energy in town grew more and more electric. On Thursday evening, the high school choir held rehearsal right in the school courtyard, students' voices soaring with a sea shanty while parents clapped along. On Friday morning, the folk band gathered at the Lantern to finalize their set list, the cafe owner cheerfully donating a steaming pot of tea and promising to serve free coffee and pastries to the audience during the concert. Rumors spread quickly. Word was that the mayor himself would attend, and a state television crew had been assigned to cover the event live. Amid this whirlwind of activity, Ethan no longer felt alone. He joined everyone in taping posters to shop windows, arranging to borrow chairs from the church, and helping string up lights along the harbor. Everywhere he went, people greeted him like a quiet hero. Each handshake, each encouraging smile, warmed the heart he'd kept locked away for so long. He heard things like, "We're proud of you, Ethan," and "Mr. Carver, you've got this," so often that he found himself stammering thank yous over and over, feeling more touched than he could say. Sophie, of course, became the little star of the town. Everyone patted her head and praised her drawings. Her sweetness, though still shy, her rosy cheeks now carried a smile more often, her confidence growing each time she stood by her father's side. Marissa was busy to the point of exhaustion. Yet every night she still found time to text Ethan, sometimes to send the rehearsal schedule, sometimes just to remind him, "Don't forget to get some sleep and save your energy." One night, she sent him a candid photo, her standing on the dock, hair lifted by the wind, the sunset blazing behind her. The caption read, "We're going to keep this moment, in this place." Ethan stared at the image, a strange stirring in his chest. He replied, "I've finished chapter 2. I'll play it for you tomorrow." That night, sitting by his window, he glanced toward his neighbor's apartment, where the TV was on, showing a news segment about the upcoming concert. He found himself smiling without thinking. For the first time in a long while, his life felt like a slow sunrise, gentle, certain, and steadily climbing. Saturday night, the Southport Harbor was more vibrant than ever. It felt as if the entire town had poured onto the docks, as the last light of the sun faded completely. Hundreds of colorful lanterns strung along the pier railings and around the small square, all lit up at once, shimmering against the night. The outdoor wooden stage at the end of the pier, usually quiet and empty, now glowed under makeshift stage lights. The scene looked like a festival, flags fluttering, blue and white fabric streamers draped overhead, the warm scent of buttered popcorn and cinnamon cookies drifting from the lantern's stall. The night sea breeze brushed gently across faces, carrying the excited laughter of the crowd. Above, a slender waxing moon rose, as if adding its own silver light to the festive air. Backstage this time marked by a large green backdrop painted with a seascape. Ethan adjusted the collar of his shirt. Tonight, he wasn't wearing his janitor's uniform. Marissa had insisted on taking him shopping for a crisp, new white shirt and a perfectly fitted black vest. "Not too formal," she teased, "but you've got to look a little like an artist." Now he found himself breathing deeply to steady his nerves in this new attire. The familiar thrill of performing stirred inside him again. Dad, Sophie came running over, tugging at the hem of his vest. Tonight, she too had been dressed by Marissa. A pale blue dress with a side braid in her hair, a small sprig of baby's breath pinned to it. She looked like a tiny angel, and in that instant, Ethan's tension melted away. "What is it, sweetheart?" he asked. Kneeling down, Sophie held out her palm. Resting in it was the small music note charm, his keepsake that he had once given her. "Take it back," she said, eyes sparkling. "For good luck. I don't need it. I know you can do this." Emotion caught in his throat. Ethan closed his fingers gently around the charm. "I promise I'll keep it safe." He smiled, then pulled her into a tight hug. She giggled, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I believe in you," she whispered. "And so does Mom Isabel." Ethan closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of his daughter's hair, his heart full of gratitude. "Ready? Maestro." Marissa's cheerful voice sounded from behind. Ethan stood and turned and froze for a beat. Tonight, Marissa looked radiant, yet familiar, wearing a long, deep blue dress patterned with silver-white waves along the hem. Her hair was loosely pinned, with a few soft strands framing her face. No glittering jewelry, just small pearl earrings. She was both striking and gentle, like the embodiment of the harbor itself, catching his gaze. Marissa flushed faintly, but quickly turned to twirl Sophie around. "Oh my goodness, you look beautiful, Princess," Sophie beamed, proudly showing off her dress. From the stage came the sound of the host's voice through the microphone. Opening the evening, Marissa took a breath. "It's our turn. You okay?" she asked, her hand squeezing Ethan's arm. He nodded with a grateful smile. "I'm okay. Thank you for everything." Before she could answer, the host's voice boomed. "Please give a warm welcome to the two artists who started this very night, Ms. O. Marissa Hale and Mr. Ethan Carver." The crowd erupted in applause. Marissa gave Ethan's hand one last squeeze before gliding out onto the stage to cheers. Ethan followed, while Sophie was led by Mrs. Mindy to sit in the front row with the other performers' children. The sight before Ethan nearly took his breath away. The crowd was larger than he had imagined. People filled the entire square, spilled out along the pier, and even craned from the back to catch a glimpse. Faces glowed with anticipation under the lights and moonlight. Ethan even spotted fishermen who had just docked, leaning against their nets to watch. All had come out of love for their town. In the front row of honor near the stage, the town's mayor, a kind-faced, middle-aged woman, waved encouragingly. Photographers wove between rows, cameras rolling. Standing at the center stage with a microphone, Marissa began to speak. She thanked everyone for coming, spoke of her childhood memories at this harbor, her first time playing piano in the hilltop chapel, summer nights watching movies right here at this open-air stage. She evoked shared memories that everyone carried a piece of. The crowd grew quiet, touched. Then she mentioned the threat of losing these things, her gaze drifting toward the far end of the pier where East Shore's development sign loomed. The audience murmured in disapproval, some whistling in protest. Marissa raised a hand for calm, smiling. But tonight isn't about anger. It's about showing what we love through music. Let's let music speak to those making the decisions. Hopefully, a few of them are listening tonight. Her gentle humor drew laughter and a burst of applause. Even from a few sheepish-looking officials, she introduced the first act, a high school choir. Students in simple uniforms lined up neatly, some with acoustic guitars, others tapping cajon drums. They performed Homeward Bound, their pure harmonies carrying lyrics of weary birds, finding their way home across evening fields. Many in the audience dabbed their eyes. Next came the town's folk band, Blue Sea Waves, filling the air with lively fiddles, banjos, and accordions. Women in the crowd swayed to the rhythm, and the lantern's owner, too excited to stay put, carried trays of coffee and bagels down the rows, offering them freely like fuel for the celebration. Backstage, Ethan waited for his turn, but unlike before, he felt no trembling. Beside him stood Marissa, who smiled at him from time to time. Below, Sophie sat in her teacher's lap, waving her hands to the country rhythm, grinning widely. The sight filled him with a quiet strength. Tonight, he wasn't alone. He belonged to this place, to these people. An hour passed in music and laughter. Marissa's set was the second to last. Under soft green lights, she took a seat at the electric piano. They couldn't bring the Steinway outdoors, so they used an amplified keyboard. She told the crowd she wanted to gift the town a song. Then she began playing River Flows in You by Yeruma, its flowing, modern melody beloved by both young and old. The music glided gently like a river, like the very stream of life carrying everyone beyond its rapids. The audience fell silent. The moon shone bright over the shimmering bay, as if thousands of fireflies were dancing along with each note. When the last note faded, the audience leapt to their feet in thunderous applause, whistles ringing through the night. Marissa bowed deeply, visibly moved. She lifted the microphone again. And now, before we close this special night, I'd like to invite the most special artist to me back to the stage. She turned toward the wings, hand outstretched. Mr. Ethan Carver, who reminded us all of music's extraordinary power, will perform an original piece of his own. The cheers roared as Ethan stepped out, applause crashing like waves. People stood, waving. He even heard Luis the carpenter call out, "Go get him!" Ethan, every face looked familiar. Marissa, seeing his slight hesitation, gently took his hand and led him to the microphone. She nodded encouragement before stepping aside. Ethan drew a deep breath. The stage lights momentarily blurred his vision, but then he found Sophie in the front row, her small hand clutching Mindy's, her wide eyes fixed on him. He thought of Isabel, of every step that had brought him here. It was time. "I've been called many things," he began, his warm voice carrying through the speakers. "A janitor, a teacher, a single dad, a man with many scars." The crowd was utterly silent. He paused, smiled softly. "But tonight, I just want to be a song." Gasps and murmurs of emotion rippled through the audience. Some already brushed at their eyes. Marissa watched him from the side of the stage, her gaze shining. Ethan took his seat at the piano, placing the music note charm atop the stand like a talisman. "I wrote this last week," he said, eyes sweeping over Sophie, Marissa, and the crowd. "It's not for the past, not for pain, not just for survival. I wrote it for what comes after." He set down the mic, inhaled, and let his fingers rest on the keys. A single low E rang out long and steady in the night air. The melody began simply, like drops of dew on leaves, honest and clear. No flashy runs, no showy tricks, just a slow, heartfelt tune, woven with deliberate pauses. The music swelled and quieted like the sea, stormy at times, serene at others, and midway through, a gentle phrase emerged, the lullaby Isabel used to sing to Sophie. It returned again and again, each time stronger, more assured, like a steady heartbeat without fear. Some in the crowd recognized it, smiling through tears. By the end, the piece didn't explode in volume, it softened, settling into a rare, deep calm, like the sea at rest after a storm. The final chord shimmered like the last star before dawn, fading into stillness. No one clapped, no one moved. It was a sacred silence. Then, one voice shouted, "Bravo!" A few claps followed. Then the dam broke. The entire crowd rose, applause thundering, some wiping tears. Ethan stood, facing them, not bowing, just meeting their gaze with quiet gratitude. His eyes found Sophie and Marissa at the edge of the stage. Sophie clutching Marissa's waist, both crying and laughing. Marissa took Sophie's hand and hurried to him. Ethan knelt, arms open, and Sophie leapt into them. The applause and cheers swelled again as townspeople rushed the stage, passing flowers into their hands. The mayor herself stepped up, gripping Ethan's hand tightly. Her eyes red, speaking into the mic, she declared, "On behalf of the town council, let me say this. No resort can replace what we have here." The crowd erupted. "Our theater will stay. Our pier will stay, thanks to our music and our spirit. The future of this harbor belongs to us." The cheers roared, hats flying into the air, confetti cannons bursting in bright colors over the stage. Ethan stood with Sophie in his arms, Marissa by his side. She turned to him with a tearful smile. He met it with a look of deep thanks. Without a word, he wrapped an arm around her waist, and she leaned in, under the night sky, amid the lights and the shouts of joy. They stood together, father, artist, and little girl who believed in miracles, holding fast to one another like a family. The next morning, the sun rose over the bay, bringing with it a brand new day. The sky was cloudless, a pure spring blue, and the breeze carried a soft, salty scent. In the Carver's small apartment, the first light of morning filtered through the curtains, brushing against Ethan's eyes. He woke earlier than usual, quietly sitting up so as not to disturb Sophie, still curled under her blanket, fast asleep in the bedroom. The apartment was unusually still. Ethan slipped into the kitchen, poured himself a steaming cup of black coffee, and sat at the small dining table. His old leather-bound music notebook lay open where he'd left it. The notes he had written the night before now belonged to the piece he had played on stage just hours ago. Chapter 2. The title he'd scrawled across the top now felt richer with meaning. Beneath it, the staff lines were filled with markings, notes of different weights, erased passages, careful circles, and annotations. On the very last page, he had written the word "end" in neat, deliberate strokes. He smiled faintly, took a sip of coffee. His life had truly turned a page. Running his hand lightly over the paper, he remembered what it had felt like to play those notes the night before. How free and whole he had felt. In that moment, he had realized music had never left him. It had simply been waiting for him to find the courage to speak again. Ethan picked up his pen and wrote a small new melody at the bottom of the page, soft, unresolved, like something waiting to be finished. Above it, he jotted a title, "Second Movement." Later that afternoon, after the cleanup at the harbor was done, Marissa invited Ethan and Sophie to her apartment for dinner. Her place was on the second floor, above an old bookshop in the historic district, facing the river. It wasn't the glamorous penthouse people might imagine, but a modest two-bedroom home with hardwood floors, an old fireplace, and shelves upon shelves of books. The late afternoon light poured through the large window, bathing the cozy space in gold. On the table, Marissa had laid out a simple but inviting meal, a steaming pot of seafood chowder, crusty garlic bread, and a green salad. Sophie squealed with delight and rushed to help set the table. Ethan rolled up his sleeves to assist, but was promptly shooed into the living room by the two ladies. He laughed and obeyed. He wandered the room, taking in framed wall art of famous theaters around the world. Interspersed with Marissa's family photos, one picture caught his eye. Marissa on her music conservatory graduation day, standing between her parents. Her smile radiant, though her eyes held a trace of melancholy. In the corner sat a classic mahogany upright piano, a sheet of Fur-Elise still resting on the stand. She must have been practicing earlier. Ethan smiled and ran his fingers over the worn ivory keys, standing there. He realized that being in front of a piano no longer brought the sharp pang of betrayal and grief over Isabel. Instead, he felt a tender ache, a gentle remembrance. He understood now that playing wasn't a betrayal of his late wife's memory, but another way to love her, a way she would have wanted him to find again, silently, he thought. Isabel, I understand now. Dinner was warm and filled with laughter. Afterward, Sophie began to yawn, her small body heavy with sleep. Marissa guided her to the sofa bed she had prepared in the living room. Sophie fell asleep the moment her head touched the pillow. Ethan tucked the blanket up to her chest, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. She smiled in her dreams. He kissed her temple softly before switching off the light. When he turned around, Marissa was standing at the open balcony door, gazing at the deep April sky where a few stars sparkled. She had changed into a thin black sweater and blue jeans, her feet bare. The river breeze tousled strands of hair across her face. Ethan poured 2 mugs of hot tea from the pot in the kitchen and stepped onto the balcony, handing one to her. "Thank you," she said, smiling gently. The small balcony held only a worn 2-seat bench and a little wooden table. They sat side by side, shoulders touching, sipping their tea in quiet. Below them, the city lay calm. Streetlights shimmered on the rippling water. Somewhere, a couple's laughter drifted up from the riverwalk. For the first time in years, Ethan felt no knot of worry at the day's end, only peace. "You know," he began, breaking the easy silence. "I used to think that playing again would feel like a betrayal of Isabel's memory." Marissa listened quietly, her gaze steady, inviting him to continue. Ethan nodded slightly, looking down at his hands. "But now I realize, maybe playing again doesn't mean I'm letting her go. Maybe it means I'm remembering her in a different way." His voice deepened. "The pain I carried, I thought it was the price I had to pay to keep her close. But now I think maybe that pain was the ground where something new could grow." Marissa said nothing. Her lips trembled slightly, her eyes bright with emotion. Slowly, she placed her hand over his, the movement careful, as if she didn't want to break the moment. Ethan's hand trembled faintly as he turned his palm to hold hers. They sat there, fingers intertwined, not dramatic, not rushed, just holding a quiet truth between them. They had found each other. Ethan didn't flinch or pull away. He looked at their joined hands, then up into her eyes. "You do this a lot," he murmured. "What?" she asked, smiling. "Catch me in the middle of a sentence. I don't even know I'm saying things like this until they're out." She chuckled softly. "And you keep reminding me who I am, before I got good at hiding my loneliness." He laughed a deep, unguarded laugh from the chest. They stayed like that for a long time, the city falling away behind them. No declarations, no grand gestures, only the slow rhythm of trust forming between 2 hearts that had once thought their music was over. It turned out they had only finished the first movement. The second was just beginning together. The following morning, Ethan woke in his own apartment, but the feeling was different from the dull sameness of before. He rose early and stepped onto the balcony to watch the sunrise. A fiery orange-red sun slowly lifted over the distant sea, painting the horizon pink. The air was fresh with the scent of salt. In Sophie's room, she was still fast asleep, hugging her star-shaped pillow. Ethan made coffee, opening the window to let the morning light spill into the apartment. For the first time, he truly heard the birds chirping on the eaves, the far-off horn of a fishing boat leaving harbor. These familiar sounds, once ignored, now felt like music. On the table lay his open notebook with the heading "Second Movement." Ethan sat down, pen in hand, and continued the notes he had sketched the night before. Ideas flowed easily now, free from fear. He smiled. Perhaps this section would be perfect for the duet he and Marissa had talked about, a piano and violin piece to be performed at the reopening of the community music hall. The restoration of the Hilltop Chapel had been approved by both the Arts Foundation and the Town Council after the concert's success. Soon, it would become Lantern Hall, named after the Lantern Cafe, a symbol of hope, a place for children and neighbors to learn and make music. Ethan would teach a small weekly piano class, something he'd never dared dream of, passing on his love of music to others. Marissa would return at least once a month, bringing young artists to perform and connect with the community, a hometown version of her successful Listening Room series from New York. That morning, Ethan planned to join the crew repairing the chapel's wooden floor. Marissa would be there too, with the new interior designs. He felt as eager as a man in his 20s. A new life awaited him each morning, now full of purpose and love. Setting down his pen, he admired the completed section. It didn't end on the tonic chord as tradition dictated, but shifted to something unexpected, a change in key, because he understood now. Some stories don't truly end. They just moved into another key, and when they do, sometimes they sound like coming home. Behind him, Sophie had woken, rubbing her eyes in the doorway. "Come here," Ethan said. Opening his arms, she climbed into his lap, nestling her head against his chest. "Good morning." "Sleepyhead," he murmured. She grinned. "Do you have to work early today?" "Today," he said, kissing her hair. "I'm working on something I love, not just for a paycheck. I think I've found what I want to do every day." "What is it?" she asked. Curious, he turned with her toward the window, where the sun lit the sea. "To listen," he said, "and to make music. Outside, the bay sparkled in the morning light. The little theater by the pier stood proudly, gulls gliding low over the waves, their calls ringing clear a morning song. Gentle waves lapped the shore in an endless rhythm. Ethan closed his eyes and truly listened for the first time in years. In the quiet, he heard it, the music that lived in the space between sounds, the echo of connection, of hearts healed, of second chances. It was the melody of peace, of love that endures, steady and strong. And it would remain here in him, in Marissa, in Sophie, and in this town they all called home. Because some stories don't end. They just change the key, and when that happens, they can sound like the familiar call of family, of belonging, like the song of home within the soul. If you value your community's treasures, its theater, its harbor, its shared spaces help keep them alive. Ethan, Marissa, and Sophie's story reminds us that art and memory are not just melodies, but the heartbeat of a town. Join local events, sign petitions for preservation, or simply share this story to spread the spirit of unity. Every small action can keep the stage lights shining, the music playing. Don't let the harbor become just a memory. Stand up, as Ethan did, and speak for what you love. Act today for a tomorrow still filled with music and hope. And don't forget to follow our channel and turn on the bell icon for more heartwarming stories every day. Thank you for listening.